The night Jeffrey Epstein died, the world didn't get answers, it got more questions. A billionaire with powerful connections, private jets, secret meetings, and a life hidden behind luxury walls, suddenly gone inside one of the most secure prisons in America. Officials called it suicide. But almost instantly, millions of people refused to believe the story. Cameras failed. Guards slept. Records disappeared. And the man who knew secrets about some of the most powerful people on Earth never spoke again. But here's what makes this story darker. Epstein's fall didn't begin in prison. It began decades earlier, quietly, carefully, while the world watched him rise as a financial genius. Behind the parties, the mansions, and the influence, investigators say a completely different life was unfolding. A life that many claim powerful people ignored for years. And just when it seemed the truth was finally coming out, everything stopped. Tonight, we're not just talking about how Jeffrey Epstein died. We're talking about how he lived, who protected him, and why his story still refuses to disappear. Because the deeper you go into this case, the more uncomfortable the questions become. And by the end of this story, one thing becomes clear: Epstein's death didn't close the case. For many people, it only opened it. Because the real mystery isn't how he died, it's what he might have revealed if he had lived. Jeffrey Epstein wasn't always surrounded by wealth and controversy. In the beginning, he appeared to be just another ambitious man trying to climb his way into elite circles. Born in Brooklyn, New York, he came from a modest background, far from the private islands and luxury estates that would later define his name. Yet somehow, without a traditional path through Wall Street, he managed to enter financial circles that most people spend lifetimes trying to reach. And that's where the first questions began. People around him often described Epstein as quiet but extremely calculating. He listened more than he spoke. He watched people carefully. And slowly, he built relationships with influential businessmen, politicians, and celebrities. To outsiders, he looked successful, a man who understood money and power. But insiders later said his real skill wasn't finance, it was access. Access to powerful rooms. Access to powerful people. And access that few fully understood at the time. Years passed, and Epstein's wealth seemed to grow faster than anyone could explain. Mansions in New York, Florida, and the Caribbean. Private jets flying across continents. Exclusive gatherings filled with famous names. Everything about his life suggested untouchable influence. But beneath the surface, allegations began to appear. At first, they were whispers, stories that didn't reach headlines. Complaints that didn't seem strong enough to challenge someone with his connections. And for years, nothing seemed to stop his rise. That silence would later become one of the most disturbing parts of the entire case. Because many would later ask, how much was known, and how much was ignored? As investigations slowly began, Epstein's public image started to crack. Lawsuits emerged. Accusations grew louder. Journalists began digging deeper into his past. And suddenly, the man who once moved comfortably among elites found himself under intense scrutiny. Yet even then, the outcome shocked many observers. In 2008, Epstein reached a controversial legal agreement that allowed him to avoid federal charges, serving limited jail time under unusually lenient conditions. Critics later called it one of the most controversial deals in modern legal history. For victims and investigators, it raised a painful question: was justice applied equally, or did influence change the outcome? The story might have ended there. But it didn't. Years later, new reporting and renewed investigations brought the case back into the spotlight. This time, the attention was global. Public pressure increased. Survivors spoke publicly. And suddenly, Epstein's past could no longer remain hidden behind wealth or connections. In July 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was arrested again, this time facing federal charges that carried the possibility of life in prison. The arrest sent shockwaves through political and social circles worldwide. News outlets everywhere asked the same question: who else might be connected? And that's when the tension surrounding the case reached its peak. Because Epstein wasn't just another wealthy defendant. He was a man rumored to possess information that could damage reputations far beyond his own. Every court appearance drew massive attention. Every document released triggered new speculation. Then, only weeks after his arrest, came the moment that changed everything. On August 10, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his jail cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York. Officials ruled it a suicide. But almost immediately, the circumstances fueled public disbelief. Reports of malfunctioning cameras, guards failing to perform required checks, earlier warnings about Epstein's mental state. The combination of errors created a storm of suspicion that continues years later. For some, it was a tragic ending to a criminal case. For others, it felt like the sudden disappearance of answers that might never be heard. And that is where the story truly becomes unsettling. Because Epstein's death didn't end the conversation, it expanded it. Investigations continued. Associates were questioned. Documents were unsealed. And public interest only grew stronger, driven by one haunting idea. What if the full story was never told? The more people examined the timeline, the more inconsistencies they believed they saw. Some demanded further investigations. Others argued that conspiracy theories overshadowed confirmed facts. The truth, somewhere in between, remained deeply complicated. And even today, years later, Epstein's name still appears whenever discussions about power, accountability, and influence arise. Because this case forced people to confront an uncomfortable reality. Sometimes the biggest stories aren't just about one person, but about systems that allow certain individuals to operate without scrutiny for far too long. And as investigators and journalists continued piecing together the timeline, one thing became undeniable. Jeffrey Epstein's story wasn't just about wealth or crime. It was about how long secrets can survive when power stands in the way of questions. And the deeper you look into what happened before his arrest, the more it feels like the ending came before the full story was ever revealed. But the deeper journalists looked into Epstein's world, the more unusual patterns began to appear. People who once openly associated with him suddenly distanced themselves. Old photographs resurfaced. Flight logs became public discussion. And every new detail created another wave of questions. Because Epstein's life wasn't built in public view, it was built behind closed doors. And that's where the story becomes uncomfortable. For years, Epstein managed to maintain an image of success and influence. He donated to institutions, surrounded himself with academics, and appeared at elite gatherings. To many observers, this created a shield, a perception that someone so connected must also be legitimate. But investigators later suggested something different. They argued that influence itself may have delayed scrutiny. And that idea changed how people saw the entire case. Because when accusations first surfaced years earlier, they didn't immediately lead to the consequences many expected. Instead, legal battles moved slowly. Settlements were reached quietly. And for a long time, Epstein returned to a lifestyle that looked almost unchanged. To critics, this raised a disturbing question. If someone without wealth or connections faced the same accusations, would the outcome have been different? That question followed Epstein everywhere after his 2019 arrest. Each court filing attracted global attention. News networks ran constant coverage. Social media exploded with speculation. And the pressure surrounding the case increased day by day. Because people believed something bigger might be revealed. And then, suddenly, the story stopped moving forward. When Epstein died inside his jail cell, the legal process ended before a trial could begin. For victims seeking answers, it felt like justice had been interrupted. For investigators, it meant many questions would never be tested in court. And for the public, it created a vacuum, one quickly filled with theories, doubts, and suspicion. Some believed the official explanation immediately. Others didn't. And that divide is one reason the story still refuses to disappear. Because the case touched on something deeper than one individual. It touched on trust in institutions, investigations, and accountability itself. The official investigation later concluded that a series of failures and negligence contributed to Epstein's death. Overworked guards, missed checks, broken procedures. A chain of mistakes that, according to reports, allowed the situation to happen. But for many people, those explanations didn't feel satisfying. Not because evidence proved otherwise, but because the circumstances felt too unusual. And once doubt enters a story like this, it rarely leaves. Years after his death, documents connected to Epstein continued to surface through court releases and reporting. Each release brought renewed attention. Each headline reopened debates that never fully ended. And slowly, the narrative shifted. The story stopped being only about Epstein himself, and became about how power operates behind the scenes. How influence can shape perception. And how public interest can outlive the central figure entirely. Because even after his death, Epstein's name remained connected to ongoing investigations, civil cases, and discussions about systemic failures. Survivors continued to speak publicly about their experiences, emphasizing that the focus should remain on accountability rather than speculation. And that reminder changed the tone of the conversation. The story was no longer just mystery and controversy. It became a warning about what happens when warning signs are ignored for too long. And as more time passed, another realization began to emerge. Epstein's rise had not been sudden. It had been gradual, built over decades, with opportunities that allowed him to move through powerful circles without serious challenge. Which meant the real story wasn't only about how everything collapsed. It was about how it was allowed to continue for so long. And that question still echoes today. Because cases like this force society to ask uncomfortable things. Who gets believed? Who gets protected? And why do some stories take years before they are taken seriously? For many observers, Epstein's death closed the legal chapter, but left the moral one unfinished. And that unfinished feeling is exactly why the story continues to resurface, again and again. Not because people are searching for shock value, but because they feel something important was never fully explained. And in stories where answers feel incomplete, attention never truly fades. The silence itself becomes part of the story. And maybe that is the most unsettling part of all. Because in the end, Jeffrey Epstein left behind more questions than conclusions. A life surrounded by wealth, influence, and secrecy, ending suddenly before the full truth could be examined in court. No final testimony. No full public accounting. Just a case that stopped, while the world was still watching. And for millions of people, that ending didn't feel like closure. It felt like interruption. An ending that arrived before the final chapter was ever written. The ending of Jeffrey Epstein's story doesn't arrive with closure. It arrives with silence. Because when the prison doors closed that night, the legal battle that many believed would expose hidden truths ended before it truly began. No courtroom testimony. No full cross-examinations. No final moment where every question could be asked under oath. Just an official conclusion, and a public that felt something unfinished remained behind. And that feeling never really went away. For the victims, the ending was complicated. Some said justice felt incomplete, because the trial they waited years for never happened. Others said the attention finally brought recognition to stories that had long been ignored. But even then, the central figure of the case was gone, leaving a gap no investigation could fully fill. And in that gap, uncertainty grew. Because Epstein's world had always been built on connections, influence, and secrecy. When someone like that disappears suddenly, the story doesn't simply end, it fragments. Pieces remain scattered across documents, testimonies, and unanswered questions. Each piece hinting at something larger, but never forming a complete picture. That's what makes this ending feel different. Most stories end with a verdict. This one ended with absence. Years later, people still debate what really happened in those final hours. Official reports point to failures and negligence. Others continue to question how such failures could occur at such a critical moment. The arguments continue, not because new answers appear, but because the old questions never fully disappeared. And maybe that is why the Epstein case continues to resurface. Not only because of who he was, but because of what his story represented. Power without scrutiny. Influence without limits. And a system that many believe reacted too late. As time passes, headlines fade. New stories replace old ones. But certain cases refuse to vanish completely. They linger in public memory, resurfacing whenever conversations turn to accountability and trust. Because deep down, people understand something unsettling about endings like this. When a story stops suddenly, the imagination keeps going. And in Epstein's case, the ending came at the exact moment the world expected answers. The moment when secrets might have been challenged publicly. The moment when the narrative could finally move from speculation to certainty. Instead, everything froze in place. No final explanation. No final confrontation. Just a name that became permanently tied to mystery and controversy. And perhaps the most disturbing part is not how the story ended, but how ordinary the final moment seemed compared to the scale of the questions surrounding it. A quiet cell. A silent morning. And a case that instantly shifted from legal investigation to historical debate. In the end, Jeffrey Epstein's life became a cautionary story, about power, about silence, and about how long uncomfortable truths can remain hidden before they finally surface. But even now, one thought continues to echo through every discussion about the case. If the trial had happened, what would the world have heard? That question has no answer. And maybe it never will. Because sometimes the most unsettling endings are not the ones filled with noise or revelation, but the ones where everything simply stops, and the truth remains just out of reach. And that is where this story finally ends. Not with certainty, but with questions that refuse to disappear.